Hello and welcome to Navarro Tuts Plus tutorial. I'm Adi Pordila, and today you'll learn how to create a very simple loader icon using SVG animations. Now, these are different from CSS animations, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. SVG animations reside in the actual SVG code. So let's kick things off by having a look at the syntax. Now, most modern browsers have support for animating SVGs by using something called SMIL. I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, but it's SMIL. This stands for Synchronized Multimedia Integration Language. Basically, this language allows you to animate certain numeric, transformation, and color attributes of an SVG. So, for example, you can animate the X or Y positions, a rotate transformation, or the fill color of an SVG. So let me show you two examples, so hopefully you can learn the basics. The first example, we just need the HTML here. So we're going to start with an SVG. We're going to give it a width of 100%, or actually, now let's make it about 500 pixels. Height is going to be the same, and let's set a view box like this. Now inside, I'm going to create a rectangle. I'm going to position it at 0, 0. I'm going to give it a width of 100 and a height also of 100. So as you can see, it created a black square. Let's give it a fill of this value. All right. Now to animate this, we're going to use the animate property inside the rectangle. That's very important. And this is actually self-closing like this. We start by giving it the attribute name. In our case, let's say I want to change the X position. Then we can specify a from value. Let's start at 0. And the to, or a to property. Let's say I want to animate this to 500. You can also specify duration, let's say 2 seconds. And as you can see, it starts animating. And let's make this repetition infinite. So we're going to say repeat count equals indefinite. So that's just going to keep repeating over and over and over. And that's it. It's that simple. That's how you can repeat an attribute of an SVG element. In our case, it's this rectangle. Now you can repeat more than just the X. All you have to do is repeat the animate and specify a different attribute. Let's say, for example, that I want to animate the width, right? So the width, I can skip the from. I can just specify a to value. Let's change its width to 500. And now you can see it also changes its width. Or we can change its color. So attribute name is going to be fill, and let's change this to black. So now we're animating 3 different attributes, X, width, and fill. Now the second example I want to show you will animate a transform attribute. So let's get started. We're actually going to start with the same SVG. We have a rectangle. Let's start this off at 250, 250. Let's give it a width of 50 pixels, also a height of 50 pixels. And we're going to change the fill slightly. Let's change this to auto preview. Okay, so that's our rectangle. Now let's add a rotation to this. In order to add a rotation, we're not going to say animate. Instead, we're going to say animate transform, like this. And this is also self-closing. And for the properties, we say, just like the previous example, attribute name, and we're going to specify transform. But this time, we can specify what type of transformation we have. So I'm going to select rotate. We can specify when the animation should begin, let's say 0 seconds if we want to start the animation right away, or you can put, for example, 1 second if you want a 1 second delay. Let's keep this at 0. Duration, let's say something like 10 seconds. And then I can specify its coordinates. So the coordinate system has three parameters. We have an angle, and then we have the x and y. So for the angle first, let's start 0, 200, 200. And we want to go to 360, so it's going to rotate to 360 degrees. And the center, let's set it to 400, 400. Okay? So now it's going to rotate like this, and it's going to change its starting point from 200, 200 to 400, 400. And let's also set the repeat count to indefinite. So it just goes on and on and on. Now, if you want this to rotate around the same point, simply set the final coordinates the same as the starting coordinates. So now it's going to rotate around the same point. What other transformations could we animate? Well, scale, for example. So let's do that. I'm going to copy this animation. But here's the thing. You can only animate a transformation at a time. You cannot have a rotation and a scale. That's one limitation that you need to keep in mind. So if, for example, I were to set the scale here, you'll see that the transform or the rotation will not work once we fill in the correct values here. So actually I made a mistake. It's transform here and scale here. All right? So now we'll just have the scale transform going on. Begin, let's say, I don't know, 0.2 seconds. Duration, let's say 3 seconds. And instead of from to, we can actually specify a list of values. So the list of values goes on like this, 1, 1. So it starts at scale 1, 1. It then goes to scale 2, 2, and then it comes back to scale 1, 1. Okay, and that's what is going on here. Scale 1, 1 basically means the original scale on both x and y axis. 2, 2 means double the scale on both axes, and then we're returning to the previous scale. And as you can see, this is what's happening. All right, so these two examples showed you the basics of working with SVG animations. Now, how do we create a loader icon from these? Well, it's really up to our imagination because loader icons come in different shapes and sizes, and you can basically animate them in any way you want. So what I'm going to do is show you two examples of loading icons, and hopefully these will serve as an inspiration and you can take these and create your own. All right, for our first example, I'm going to start with an SVG, and I'm going to give it a width of 51 pixels, a height of 50 pixels, and we'll set a view box of 0, 0, 51, and 50. All right. Now, this loader that I want to show you is very simple. It's based on three rectangles that will just change their height. Not at the same time, they will have a slight delay between them, but they will give the impression of a loading action. So let's start with a rectangle. We'll position this at y0. We'll give it a width of 13, a height of 50, and a fill of this value. Of course, feel free to change the colors in any way you want. Then we're going to animate. The attribute name will be height, and then the values are going to be as follows: 50, 10, and 50 again. So we're basically changing its height. Starting at 50, we'll go down to 10 and then back to 50. Begin, we'll set this to 0. Let's animate this over 1 second duration and repeat count is going to be indefinite. And that is our animation right there. Let's go ahead and copy this rectangle 2 more times, and we're going to adjust the parameters on these other ones. So this is actually going to start at 19. The width is also going to be 13, height 50, but we'll change the fill color to something like this. The animate will also change its height, same values, but will begin slightly later, 0.2 seconds. Also duration 1 second. All right, so as you can see, they are staggered because I added that 0.2 seconds delay. The third one, the X value is going to be 38, and if you're wondering how I got to here, well, the first rectangle starts at 0 and it has a width of 13 pixels. The other one, the second one, starts at 19, so there's a 6 pixel gap between the first and the second. To create the third, well, I say 19, which is the starting point for the second bar, plus 13, which is its width. That is what? 32. Plus the 6 pixel gap between the bars is 38. We'll change the fill color to this one to 06 FFCB, and for the animate we'll set a 0.4 second delay. Right? So by itself that already looks like a pretty good loader. But we can do something extra. We can also animate the Y attribute. So when it gets smaller in height, we can also move it down a little bit. So let's do that. Let's copy this animate attribute. Let's set this to Y. The values are going to be 0. Let's say we want this to go to 20 and then back to 0. Yeah. So see how the animation changed? It's like these bars are vertically aligned to the center and they just change their height both in both direction, top and bottom. Also begin 0 second, duration 1 second, the rest remains exactly the same. So I'm going to copy this to the other 2 rectangles, and all I have to do is change the begin to match the begin on the first animation. So 0.2 and 0.4. And there we have it. So that was pretty easy, right? Hand-coded SVG, simply using rectangles, and it creates a nice loading icon. So to recap what we did here, we have 3 rectangles that are the same width and the same height, but each of them start at a different X value. And on each, we're animating the height and the Y values. And the second and the third begin 0.2 seconds later than the one before it. It's really that simple. Now, let me show you a more complex example. And this is a more complex example because it involves creating our loading icon in a separate program and then copying that SVG code from there and animating it. So I'm going to start with this, an SVG again. Let's set a width for this to 50 and a height to 50 and a view box 005050. All right. Next, we're going to create a path. Oops, not like that. So path, we're going to set a fill, just a random color here. Now for the actual path, we're going to need some help. So I'm going to fire up Illustrator, and I basically want to create like a circle, or the stroke of a circle. It's going to be a bit thicker, and we're going to cut it in half. And then we're going to keep rotating that. I'm sure it's a very common pattern, that one. So let's create a new document here in Illustrator. Let's make it 50 by 50 to match the SVG that we coded right there. All right, let me see if I can resize this. Let's start with the oval tool or the ellipse tool. Let's draw a circle that's, well, 50 by 50. Let's make this pixel perfect. All right, let's remove the fill. We don't need that. And let's set the stroke to something bigger, like maybe 5. Yeah, I think that looks pretty good. So what I'm going to do now is take a rectangle. I'm going to make a rectangle like this and just get rid of the stroke. And I'm going to align this to the middle of my circle, select both of them, and then hit minus front. Oops, sorry, I didn't do that correctly. I don't really work in Illustrator, so first we gotta expand this to make it a shape. So let's go to Object, Expand Appearance, there we go. And then repeat the process, minus front. So now we're left with just this shape. So I'm gonna double click inside and actually select this bit. And I'm gonna drag this handle to create rounded corners. All right, so now what I'm gonna do is simply go to File, Export, Export As. I'm gonna select Export to SVG, and I'm gonna choose Show Code. And that will actually give us the path information that you see right here. So I'm gonna copy this, I'm gonna go back to my pen, I'm gonna paste this in, and now we have the actual path. All we have to do now is rotate it. So I'm gonna say animate transform, attribute name is going to be transform, type will be rotate, and we're going to say from 0 for angle, 25, 25 is the exact center of my element, and 2, I'm going to set an angle of 360 and also 25, 25. So by doing this, I make sure that my path will rotate around its circle. Let's set a duration of, let's say, 0.5 seconds and repeat count indefinite. And that's it. We now have this loading icon. And you can make this more interesting. You can, for example, create the same circle which wasn't cut off and have it sit exactly in the middle of it, but decrease its transparency. As I said, you can do all sorts of things. These are just 2 examples to get you started and maybe provide some inspiration. And also, of course, the technique that you need to create this kind of animation. That was pretty cool, right? And quite simple. Now, what are the pros and cons for using these kinds of SVG animated loaders versus GIFs or GIFs? Nowadays, if you search Google for loader icon or loading icon, you'll find a lot of websites that basically offer you GIFs, animated GIFs. So why should you use SVG animations like this versus GIFs? Well, first of all, GIFs are not scalable. So, on high DPI screens, they're going to look blurry. They're images. So basically, you have to make an additional HTTP request to get that image. And as we know, it's always a good thing to keep that request number as low as possible to have good performance on your website. And third, they're not directly customizable like the SVG ones. Here, if you want to change the color, you just change the color in the SVG code. But with a GIF loader, you have to go back to the app that created that GIF, change the color, re-export it, re-upload it. So there are a few extra steps. With that said, these kinds of SVG loaders or SVG animations in general are not perfect. i.e., Internet Explorer and Edge do not support them. So they don't work. I don't know if Edge will implement SMIL, the language that I mentioned earlier that makes everything possible. But for now, they don't work. They just appear as static SVGs. Another reason they're not perfect is that SVG code might be hard to understand. So depending on the loader that you want to create, you can actually have a lot of SVG code to write. So yeah, they might not be as approachable as a GIF loader. Now, with that said, if you want to learn how to hand code SVGs, you should check out the written version of the tutorial. Kes Bracey, our colleague, has made a fantastic tutorial on how to hand code SVGs. So you'll have all the basics there. Make sure you check that out. And that's it for this tutorial. What do you think about SVG animations? Do you see yourself using these now or maybe in the future once browser support is a little bit better? What do you think about in general versus maybe GIF loaders? Let us know down in the comments. We would love to hear from you. I'm Adi Purdila. Thank you very much for watching this tutorial, and until next time, take care.